Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from Europe. We are actually a few seconds before the start time of this event. Thank you all for logging in, and thank you for our group of experts who are going to help us conduct the discussion today. My name is Corina Rebeja. I'm a fellow in residence at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, DC. And here at CEPA, since the start of the coronavirus crisis, we have been grappling with the multifaceted implications of the public health crisis, and also the corresponding emergency measures that most countries on the European continent and in the transatlantic space, more generally speaking, have decided to implement. And we've looked at the geopolitics, we've looked at defense, we've looked at disinformation and so on. Today, we would like to invite you to a conversation about what all these measures mean for our political and social structures, for our values and principles, and whether the pandemic is likely to have a transformative impact on democratic politics and governance. And we know it's still too early to grasp the full spectrum of consequences, or even when this crisis might end, but I think we are seeing a lot of worrying signs and perhaps some encouraging signs as well. And I would like us to take a deeper dive into those aspects today. And I'm very happy to have three experts from Central and Eastern Europe joining our conversation and guiding us through some of these difficult questions today. I'd like to briefly introduce them. I'll start with Kata Balint, who is an analyst, mainly working on radicalization and extremism for Political Capital, an independent policy research and consulting institute based in Budapest. Previously, Kata has also worked at the Office for Hungarian National Assembly and the European Parliament. Kata, thank you very much for joining us. Then Sorin Ioniță from Romania is an expert in public administration, reform and development. He has an impressive career. He is the founder and president of respected think tank, or I should say activist think tank, as I like to call them, called Expert Forum. Sorin, welcome back to CEPA. And not least, Ruslan Stefanov, the director of the economic program at the Center for the Study of Democracy, also the coordinator of the Southeast European Leadership for Development and Integrity network, working on regional anti-corruption with civil society groups. Ruslan also has been a long-standing partner of CEPA. Ruslan, welcome back. For those of you watching us or joining us from the audience, if you would like to ask a question to any of the speakers, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can also reply to the live stream on Twitter or ask your question on Twitter. Make sure to use the hashtag #CommonCrisis. If you can't find the Q&A feature on Zoom, just move the cursor to the bottom of your window. We plan on taking as many questions as possible on the second part of our discussion, so please bear with us. Moving on now to our panelists, let us dive into the conversation directly. I've started with the worrying signs and the concerns raised by many international and domestic NGOs. They've been ringing the alarms about how the emergency measures and the state of emergency declared by many governments might actually find a way to solidify the tendencies to concentrate power by the executives and further limit or open the door for a limitation of rights and freedoms. We see how electoral processes have been affected, whether elections have been postponed or not, whether the ability to campaign and connect with the electorate, which might raise questions about the fairness of the electoral process, but also we've seen an incredible overreach of the executive power in some countries, curtailing the freedom of expression, curtailing transparency, and really just reinforcing the question about whether we are embarking on an authoritarian wave, with a particular concern when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe. And I would like to turn to our guests to comment a little bit on how they see the emergency measures in their countries, but also in the broader region, impacting the resilience, or actually the kind of the youthfulness of our democratic institutions, whether they see this as a long-term trend, or whether they see an opportunity here, particularly for civil society trying to keep the governments in check. And I'll start from the south, moving to the north, and I'll start with Ruslan. Again, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Corina, and hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, and good afternoon to everybody else in Europe and whatever people might be watching. Thanks for having me. Actually, we were able to do at CEPA the presentation of our Kremlin playbook in Southeast Europe just at the end of January, when all these measures were not imposed, and it is great to be back. And you might remember, I mean, we already discussed then about the governance gaps that already exist, and I'm particularly looking at the Balkans, but the Western Balkans and Bulgaria, of course, my home country. And these gaps have not gone away. And actually, the emergency legislation that have been imposed in many countries, including in Bulgaria, but also in the Western Balkans, will likely lead to worries whether they will not further roll or enhance these gaps. And actually, I would be more of a skeptical side that we as civil society need to pay particular attention to that, because it is natural that in those times people will tend to be less critical, trying to be more constructive. But at the same time, we need to be very, very careful as to whether there is and it's a very fine balance, and it's a much finer balance than we used to have before, between to tell people what exactly is the situation that we're facing, how grave it is, and whether measures that have been taken are proportionate, whether there are enough checks and balances, and so on and so forth. So starting from Bulgaria, I should say that the Bulgarian government introduced an emergency situation in the country on March 13th, one of the earlier start days, and there have been the good news is that the Bulgarian parliament continued debating, continued working, and I think this has resulted in Bulgaria rolling back some of the most negative introductory measures, such as the provision for example, for imprisonment of people that spread fake news without a definition of fake news or without any ideas what this might be. The idea of suspending any rules and regulations on public procurement, or on any public procurement, not just the one that relates to tackling the crisis, healthcare, and so on, and of course the introduction of certain larger constraints on Roma ghettos, for example, in particular. So these are all signs of things to come. And just a couple of more thoughts, if you allow me. What we are really worried about is that in all the countries in the Western Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe and in Bulgaria, there has been already a trend of democratic backsliding. I think this trend is much more severe in the countries of Western Balkans than it is in the EU, not least because the EU has some mechanisms, including in the European Parliament, including peer pressure from other countries. But it has also been natural that within the crisis, it's been visible that countries have fallen back to their national boundaries, tried to contain the crisis, which is normal. I also think that the EU has managed at the later stage to contain or to preserve some normalcy. But I think we are just in the beginning of this reinforcement of governance gaps that have existed, in particular in the media. I mean, if you think about it, the economic crisis that had started to dissipate, the one that we saw already in 2008, that made a lot of the media go bankrupt and be only related to either government, rely on government contracts or on oligarchs. This has now changed, and again we see imperiled media, imperiled journalists. Of course, there will be and a public that, driven by fear, might be more willing to accept that journalists are not free to speak. And in this domain, I think civil society has a very powerful role. We need to stand up. We need to speak up on all these cases. In the case of Bulgaria, these were the measures that a lot of civil society people stood up against. I think also the fact that the parliament continued its normal work also helped dissipate these worst excesses. But also, I think we need to follow through on the economic crisis and see what the effects they're going to be. And of course, this is going to have effect on civil society, and it also already has also on our power to transform, because we effectively were offline organizations when it comes to impact. But again, this has pushed us to transform quickly, as also this webinar shows. And when it comes to the Western Balkans in particular, but also in Europe, we can again see that this debate about authoritarianism being better than democracy at handling things is going to erupt again, and it is very actively supported by both China. For the first time, I have to say, China in a very in a fashion that resembles Russia in an aggressive way in terms of trying to shift blame, whereas apparently they needed to share with the world much more and better and earlier information. And of course, Russia, which we've seen in the same manner that we've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, they've been particularly active also on the Balkans, trying to portray themselves as saviors, both in terms of PR effects of aid, but also in terms of the broader ideological kind of winning of hearts and minds on authoritarian and democratic regimes. So I think these are the gaps we need to follow. So media in the first place, the role of parliaments. This is where civil society can help uphold institutional constraints. In Europe in particular, it's also important to work with the European Parliament, with European institutions who provide some sort of peer pressure between the countries. We've seen learning curves and learning between countries in Europe in particular, and of course tackling also these outside pressures on these same governance gaps or fissures. Again, I think ultimately it will be what we call state capture, or these gaps that allow local oligarchic networks to capture institutions, to capture media, to capture certain functions of the government, in particular in this situation where there will be less oversight on spending. This might make these networks more potent. And I will stop here, and so that we have time also for others to say a few words and go into discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. And I think you did a great overview of the complexity of issues that are actually coming to surface in the context of this crisis. And there are a lot of problems that are actually compounded, both domestic, related to governance and oversight and accountability, but also in a geopolitical context. And this drive to authoritarianism is not only a domestic governance issue, but also a question of the seductive power of malign foreign actors' propaganda. And I hope we can go back to that issue later in the conversation, and also to the role of the EU, because I think the EU has had such a transformative power in Central and Eastern Europe for at least 2 decades. So perhaps we can go back to where we see that going further. I'll turn to Sorin now to get a perspective from Bucharest on all of these issues.
Yes, thank you, Corina. I think our problem as civil society, as societies in Eastern Europe, in this region over here, is that our problems did not start with this coronavirus crisis. In the last 2 or 3 years, we were already speaking about the shrinking space for civil society, about limitations for freedom of speech, about propaganda, about fake news, and so on and so forth. So there is a background against which this new crisis adds a new layer of problems. And the problems come, I would put them in 3 boxes. First, we have this new enthusiasm for electronic surveillance, which is of course motivated for controlling the population in the crisis and the movement of population. And this new enthusiasm, I'm afraid it will borrow increasingly from the menu of tools developed by the Chinese mostly. Not only by them, but probably they have the most developed menu for artificial intelligence, for algorithms to control the movement of the population. Second are the limitations for the freedom of speech. And they come in various shapes and forms, but in an emergency like this, even though with the best of intentions, when governments start to speak about punishing the dissemination of fake news, that's worrying, actually, because I mean, we all fight against fake news. We have programs, we are involved as civil society activists in exposing, debunking fake news, whether internal or coming from the outside. But the problem is, we all know because of that, how fluid the notion of fake news is, how difficult it is to define it in legal terms, and how dangerous is for a government to attach criminal penalties to the so-called dissemination of fake news. And this is a trend, on which some governments in the region would like to move. And we are not yet there. We are not yet there in our countries, but we have to be, alert to this danger. And the third box, the third category of problems are other limitations which are introduced for human rights, so to speak. So, for example, my country, Romania, suddenly applied Article 15 of the Council of Europe of the Charter of Human Rights, which means a suspension, from the provisions of the Charter for the period of this emergency. And the problem is they didn't even announce it. We learned it from Strasbourg, actually, through the media. The government still has no announced as of today why they did it. Informally, we think it's mostly about the regime of people in jails, in penitentiaries, where conditions continue to be awful, as it was a case, always in the past, and we got penalties and we got fines. So probably the government was preparing the ground to avoid some fine in this difficult period, because, when you have a coronavirus crisis, it's not very funny to be in jail, actually, for other crimes. So the conditions are not better than before. Having said that, so we have these 3 categories of dangers or trends that we need to monitor in every country. There's one big thing that makes a lot of difference. And many times we shy away, from hitting the nail in the head. It's not the same thing to have in a country a regime like that of Viktor Orban, or like that the Romania was having last year, or the regime that Romania is having this year. So it makes a lot of difference what kind of government you have, what kind of instincts they have, and what is the direction they want to pursue. Last year, if we had this crisis last year at this time, I would be very worried by the government, by the measure introduced by the previous government of Romania. While today, with the government in office, we are a little bit more, more patient. We have space to wait and see what is coming on. It's the same thing in Poland, for example. Is not the same thing to have the government they have today, or maybe a future government who will be more liberal, so to speak. This is a dimension which is very important, and I think we can tolerate some restrictions, some surveillance, if the government gives proofs that we can trust them, that they have liberal instincts, and that they will keep the institutions in place, they will keep the rule of law in place, and they will allow judiciary to be independent and to check on these measures. If not, we have every reason to be worried. And what is going on in Russia today, there were speeches and there were whistleblowers and there were politicians in the small Russian oppositions who are starting to speak about cyber gulag in Russia, which is, this mixture of electronic surveillance, limitations, police descending on the little free media that still exists in Russia, everything under the cover of the emergency regime because of the coronavirus. So this is my analysis for the start, and we can develop a little bit later this what role the propaganda and the Russian and the Chinese models are playing in the region, in particular during this coronavirus crisis.
Thank you, Sorin. Again, a lot of issues. My main takeaways from what you said is actually one of the questions that I asked at the beginning, and perhaps we will go back to it, is whether the measures or what worrying signs we're seeing from the governments in Central and Eastern Europe, but not only, are building on pre-existing trends, what we're calling backsliding of democratic institutions' behaviors or political leadership. The second thing is political leadership matters. And I think perhaps we can go back to that because Central and Eastern European countries have been in a state of political transition for the past 30 years. And this has always been a question of whether the democratic path is consolidated or there is no risk of kind of rolling back. And we see that risk all the time. And I'm wondering if this crisis is likely to amplify the negative trends more so than the positive trends, like moving online and activating civil society even more. And then also finally, this idea that leaders are actually learning from each other, and they're not learning sort of the positive governance aspects, they're learning more techniques and tools on how to expand their power, consolidate their power, further infringe, constrict the space for civil society and for the freedom of speech. And I think there are plenty of models from Russia, China, and elsewhere that some of these leaders might emulate. But before we go back to these points, let me turn to Kata. Hungary has been in the media quite a lot since the beginning of this month, and not only as one of the negative examples, unfortunately. Where do you see Hungary faring with respect to the other, or in comparison with other Central and Eastern European countries and other European countries? Kata, what's your assessment?
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this debate. So I actually have to join in on a lot of what Roslyn and Sorin has already said. I think we see a lot of the same mechanisms working in our countries. And I have to amplify that in Hungary, what we're seeing is the continuation of a trend of democratic backsliding, and we see that it's what is happening at the moment is sort of an ideal opportunity for the government to centralize its power even further. Yeah, I would like to also join in on you must have heard about the Authorization Act that was passed at the end of March, and that was one of the measures that was taken that was highly controversial and drew a lot of international criticism, because essentially the government passed the act in a way that that they have parliamentary authorization to have the state of danger without a sunset clause, which is very problematic, and that is something we don't see anywhere else in Europe. And the other part that I have to join in on as well is the attacks on media and the attacks on freedom of speech, because one of the parts of this act was changes in the criminal code, which essentially means that those who publish information on the coronavirus that might agitate the public in Hungary, or that might hinder the protection of Hungarian citizens, could face up to 5 years in jail, which is something that is also very problematic. We see that this is essentially in line of fighting against fake news and disinformation, and we also see that in the public media as well as in government closed media, there's a lot of attacks on free and independent news outlets, stating that they are essentially spreading fake news and disinformation. But what we're actually seeing, and why this is actually quite controversial, is that a lot of these news outlets themselves do spread fake news and disinformation. So yeah, in terms of civil society and the attacks on civil society, so far we have not seen any new measures in Hungary that would be directly impacting civil society organizations themselves. We have seen a continuous attack since 2013 and 14. And I have to agree with Ruslan that the economic impact will definitely have an influence on the work of NGOs as well. But the silver lining, what we're seeing here in Hungary, is that there is an overabundance of solidarity and of people coming together and volunteering and trying to help where they can. And I think that if NGOs can channel this into their own work, then that could be a very positive outcome of this. Yes, I think that's it for now, and then let's turn to the next question.
Great, thanks, Kata, for ending on a positive note. And I think we've done a great job sort of explaining all the different layers of the problems, and we will go back to that. But since you mentioned the role of civil society and the negative trend that we have seen in the region in terms of the depreciation of democratic institutions, what opportunities do you see for civil society groups, for think tanks, for just citizen initiative in sort of pushing back against this consolidation of executive power? And I mean, we've been at this or in this battle for a long time, and civil society has always been on the front lines trying to fight back and demand more accountability. And Ruslan, you were talking about and Sorin as well, everyone actually, about the media and their fundamental role to maintain the public informed and engaged. The situation seems to be getting dire or more dire for civil society. What opportunities do you see for citizens to actually push back against tightening governmental control?
Well, if I would be to start on this. Well, first of all, doing what we've all done in the past, but in a new way, through online media. Certainly, there's been a lot that has been done, from civil society in terms of advocacy, in terms of sharing the good practices from other countries, both on health care, but also on economic follow-up, but also on good governance. I think this has spared, actually, I forgot to mention this, but this has spared also Bulgaria suspending the human rights charter, at least parts of it during its emergency measure situation. So I think Romania might have, and Hungary's example might have had some positive impact here, because they saw that this has had a negative repercussion for the image of the country internationally. So this might have occurred. At the same time, I also think that at least what we're seeing is, of course, great opportunities for civil society to fill in gaps where governments have been incapacitated to react quickly. And I think some of the really good measures for social civic compassion, for designing, for overseeing, some of the initial elements of excess and so on and so forth have been very effective at doing so. This is part of what we've been trying to do, and of course this is just the front line. We've seen many donors that have actually sprung to help citizens and civic organizations, and of course I think in the longer term also keeping communication channels with the governments, in particular with parliaments, is important, and of course with international partners. This I think is some of the things that have been missing, for example, more in countries in the Western Balkans. But at the same time, I think the networks that have been developed have helped us actually also there have an impact. I think also it has been great that the EU has been able to overcome its negative kind of reaction on Albania and North Macedonia in the past. This has given a boost to those countries. But again, I don't think that we will see governance gaps go away. But we need to prepare to be back on track and to exactly use this crisis to remind people and to show that these bad decisions in the past have impacted and now impact the capacity of the governments and of societies to respond. Like, for example, large infrastructure projects that have gulped in a lot of resources that are now completely useless, like South Stream or power plants, being built in the case of Bulgaria and so on and so forth. So I think these are also times when we could actually make people more sensitive and understand better why having a better governance, why attending to the needs of social systems like healthcare and education is important in these times.
Thank you, Ruslan. I don't know if Sorin or Kata want to address this question as well.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, civil society. So there are 2 or 3 things that we need to say and be very blunt about it. But first, what is civil society? I think there's increasingly blurry the border between civil society and the media in our countries. Because there are problems with the media, as you know. The established channels, part of them are going underwater because of economic reasons. We are small markets as countries with small languages in terms of number of users. And a lot of it, the traditional media, is captured actually by politicians and by the government and by business groups. And increasingly, for example, investigative journalism is coming from these new cooperatives or freelancers, upstarts, groups who are active mostly on the internet. The most relevant investigations in Romania in the last year that I remember about were pursued by such groups actually. So there's increasingly unclear where the civil society, classic civil society stops and the new media starts. So I'll put both in the same box, and I think they have a twofold or maybe threefold mission in this difficult period under lockdown. First, of course, there are a lot of initiatives. Everybody's reporting about them. Beautifully, in Romania, it comes immediately after the 2 or 3 years of big protest, of civic activism. So the people find it a little bit easier now to organize, to collect money, for example. And we have this beautiful example in Romania of the only new hospital in Romania after the fall of communism, which is financed by public subscription by an NGO actually, and they will manage to build a hospital actually, 15 million euros through public subscription, because the government is not governments have not been able to do this. Such people are, you know, there are dozens and dozens of organizations, I'm sure in every country, doing a lot of useful stuff today. But the second mission of us and the new media is to keep the interest of people alive for politics, because politics this period is in a way in suspension. Opposition politicians, we were supposed to have local elections in Romania in June. Now this is put off, of course, but the problems are still there. You still have cities to manage, you still have a country to manage, and the only people who are visible are those in office today, of course. Opposition is completely invisible because they don't have an arena to manifest themselves, and because, you know, it's tricky to appear to be doing politics these days, you know. But there are very, very urgent problems to be addressed. One is to supervise public procurement precisely in this period of emergency, because there are fast-track procedures. They are buying a lot of things. Mayors in Romania are blowing off the budget, you know, because they know that cuts will follow. So this is a last train for them to blow off some money through fast-track procurement, actually, even on things completely unrelated to the medical equipment buying or the crisis and so on. So we need to monitor this precisely in these 2 months, in April, in May, in June, because afterwards it will be too late. And there are other topics which are essential in this period, like the quality of living, the environment, the pollution, the urban pollution. This was a main topic before the crisis. We were preparing for these local elections, and we thought we will a very vivid campaign with a lot of candidates speaking about air pollution, waste management, traffic, which are the problems, especially in the city of Bucharest. They will continue to be there after the crisis, when these restrictions are lifted, and nobody's addressing them. We forgot about these things. We need to keep this conversation alive, and this is our role in a way, because opposition candidates would be blamed immediately that they start doing politics. So I think we have these missions, and you know, we have to be there, and we have to be bold in telling people, you know, politics is important if you do it right. We should not forget about it, because it is about the quality of governance in this country. We cannot put everything in suspension, you know, because we might have a second wave of the virus in the autumn, and then what do? We put the whole year in suspension and leave these guys in power unsupervised, or the mayors in the big cities of Romania. This is unacceptable. We have this role to fulfill, and this is a bit difficult because we are still, we are like everyone else, confined at home.
Thanks, Sorin. Kata, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just one quick thing to add. So in terms of the role of civil society organizations and how they can work in this environment, I think one of the things that is really important right now for these organizations is to reach out to their network and especially international network, and to call the attention to what is happening in these countries, because I feel that that can be very powerful, and we have seen this even with the Authorization Act in Hungary, that international outrage and the statements of international actors and sort of the countering of what is happening in Hungary by powerful international actors does make a difference. So I think that is very, very important. I do not see, I mean, in the past couple of years, civil society organizations have not really been closely working together with the government, and it's quite a one-sided relationship, and I do not see that changing in this environment. But I do believe that reaching out to international networks and working on that side is very, very important.
Excellent, agreed. And I want to turn to the questions from the audience, because we have a few questions that actually build on what all of you have just said. And let's start with one of them that has to do actually with this issue of governance gaps that have always been there, that we have been trying to close, this danger of state capture and all the things that go under the radar because we are in a state of emergency. And we have a question about how we prioritize the various concerns. So of course we have legitimate concerns about the spread of the virus and trying to contain it and flatten the curve. And all the impact on government institutions and transparency and oversight. But then people also have socioeconomic concerns. And we are anticipating an economic hit ensuing after this crisis. So how do we balance those two priorities? This is coming from the audience. The second question is more about the international and regional aspects, so I will come back to that. I don't know who wants to
Can
start.
I start with this balance?
Please do.
Very briefly, because it is again something that I will relate to the role of civil society and the media, the honest and independent media. We need to keep sanity of the conversation, of the public conversation on our countries, precisely because in this period, people are more emotional. They want to get clarity from the government. They want to know precisely what to do. They want to get predictions so that they plan their lives. So people are, anxious, and that's normal. We have to be honest, because politicians will not be. They are afraid to tell people the truth, that some things we know, some things we don't know, and we cannot forecast. We don't know when the problems are going to end. We don't know when the restrictions are going to be lifted. We don't know how bad the economic situation is going to be. But what we know is that there is a trade-off between the length of the lockdown and the depth of the crisis afterwards. And at some point, we know, and there's a beautiful article in The Economist last week about this trade-off between the economic costs that are going up and then our anxiety and emotions and our feelings that we need to stay in-house as long as possible. At some point, there will be a tip-off. And people will start to care more, or some people will start to care more about the economic effects. And we will see budgetary effects. And at that point, we should be prepared to accept some social pain in order to reopen the economy. This is not something that a politician will tell the population these days, because it's very easy to be misunderstood and you pay a political cost. I think it is also our role, our third role, on top of the two other missions that I spoke about before, to start this debate in society. At some point, where do you strike the trade-off? Because there is a trade-off. You will pay with lives in order to open the economy. If you don't discuss about it, the trade-off does not disappear. You just put the burden on the shoulders of the doctors, for example, who struggle with limited resources, and they make these life or death decisions every day. You just don't want to admit it publicly because, it's something uncomfortable to discuss. But we shouldn't be coward. Politicians will be coward. They will never discuss these things. But we should, as opinions leaders, to the extent that we are, that we have some people listening to us.
Ruslan, please.
Yeah, Corina, I was just thinking along similar lines. I think if there's one thing that the crisis does, it's set priorities. Clearly healthcare is number one. So taking care of that we get out of this with this little impact on our healthcare systems, on the people's lives is important. So I think no matter whether you look at authoritarian countries or democratic countries, responses, politicians have felt the heat. What I would argue is, though, that clearly democratic countries have been swifter to respond to the needs of their citizens and population. And the problem with the response coming from China has been that it's been very much delayed, and we haven't really gotten much of the real pictures. You know, clearly there's been a global disconnect. You know, clearly we didn't heed early enough what was going on. You know, so we didn't. Although there've been many early warnings, although there've been many detailed plans in place, including in Europe. You know, Germany had such a plan. Other countries had such plans. You know, there was a visible gap between seeing what was happening in China and not taking measures in Europe. At the same time, I think after this is unfolded, the clear priority is you know, how to get out of this with the least casualties, so the least people you know, ending up in hospital and dying, and at the same time preserving the economy. And I think again, and here I think we already have the lead with the debate that the European countries and the US on these decisions have been leading the world. And I think this is, I mean, this is the importance of keeping public debate alive. This is the importance of keeping parliaments open. You know, this is the importance of having opposition speak up. This is the importance of civil society speaking up, because I think in these debates, it is the easiest to find the right path, you know, or even if you make a wrong step, then quickly recover. And I think this is why civil society can be most influential. I think also it's important for our countries. It's important that we depend, in particular in the Balkans, including Romania, but Bulgaria and the Western Balkans, we depend a lot on international assistance, you know, on European funds in the case of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and in the Western Balkans, they also depend a lot on remittances and stuff like that. So the more we're able to preserve our connections between countries, the better. So I think civil society with their links and with the networks that have been created are an important player to deal with. And I think in all these, though, we need to not forget that governance does matter, you know, because the capacity to respond of the countries has been constrained both in healthcare and in the economy because of the governance gaps. You know, people in Bulgaria, in the Western Balkans, it's been much easier to reach out to oligarchic structures, to media, to larger enterprises than going to micro enterprises, going to people with free professions, going to SMEs. Comparing the response, and even in Europe, I mean, comparing the response, let's say, and you see this on the web pages on what Switzerland has been able to do in a matter of a week, reaching out to more than 70,000 micro and small enterprises, and the incapacity of countries in Central and Eastern Europe actually preparing mechanisms to get emergency aid from Europe. You know, money that is there, that is ready. Speaks volumes about why it's important to have governance mechanisms functioning well. If you don't have them in place, it's very difficult to create them under emergency conditions. So these are the things that we need to remember, and we need to push for these reforms. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, thanks Ruslan for this, and I think we cannot stress enough how important to have a well-functioning system is, and this has indeed been tested, and we are seeing the difference between, as you said, between more consolidated democracies and weaker democracies, and in terms of the effectiveness of their response. And this has always been the question, right? Whether democracy works, whether it is efficient, whether it's able to deliver. And this is where the competition from Chinese and government, or Russian government, the Kremlin, is building on, trying to show that authoritarianism is actually more effective. And if we're better at communicating and cutting through the smoke screen, I think we will see that it's not. We have a question particularly about Hungary. So Kata, please also address this question, but let me take this question from our audience. And our participant is wondering whether outside criticism, and there has been plenty towards the Hungarian government recently, has had any impact on the government's behavior. And if none, what action by NATO or the EU would have an impact on the government? And I think we can also turn to the other panelists. I think it's a good question to actually end on. How strong is the leverage of these international alliances or supranational bodies still is for Central and Eastern European democracies?
Yes, thank you. I do think that as I said previously, I do think that it is very important for these international actors to take a stand. And what we have seen just recently was actually that the government. So the government tried to pass a legislation that would essentially curtail the freedom of local municipalities, in the sense that their decisions would be supervised by a body that would be filled in with governmental close people. And what we have seen there is, once the text came out, just 16 hours later, they withdrew the text itself. And I think that partly, I mean, it is difficult to say because we can't really see behind the scenes, but I do believe that international actors, especially, for example, from the European Parliament and from the EU, that played a role in that. In response to the question before, I just wanted to raise one small addition, and looking at it from a different perspective. I think what it is only natural for people to turn to stronger leaders or strong leaders when they're in this sort of situation, in these sort of crises, because they feel this threat, this immediate threat and fear and constant insecurity. So what I think that we need to pay attention to is that nationalistic and populist politics will rise again, and possibly in the near future that these sort of leaders will get stronger. So that was just a tiny addition to that.
Thank you, and I thought you were the optimist. I mean, it's become pretty clear who's benefiting most from the fear and anxiety that this crisis has been, and I think that's why we're also having this conversation, to see how we mitigate some of these sort of malicious political behaviors that we anticipate might rise as a result of the crisis. But I want to, we still have a few minutes. I want to dig a little deeper into what the international bodies can do, particularly NATO and the EU. And like I said, they've had a tremendous transformative power for a while, at least in Central and Eastern European countries. Is that power still standing? Are EU values and principles and mechanisms still important, still make a difference? And will the EU and the Transatlantic Alliance more generally be able to continue some of the initiatives in terms of rule of law, strengthening democratic governance, now that we're facing this crisis and our attention will potentially shift more towards mitigating the economic crisis effects? Sorin.
Well, mitigating the economic crisis, first, it depends how big it is, so how big the problem is, and it depends how each country responds to it, and what kind of leverage Brussels have in each country, because even until last year, it's hard to make predictions. Look, there's very little leverage on people like Viktor Orban, for example, but there was a lot of leverage although it was not always seen, on the previous government of Romania for 3 years, so before November 19, who were a team of leaders which were very envious of Viktor Orban. They were trying to copy Viktor Orban. They were copying actually things from this agenda, including anti-Soros propaganda, memes, and even consultants. They were exchanging consultants at some point with Fidesz. And they were not the only ones. Vučić is doing the same thing in Serbia. So there are many mini dictators. Yeah. But the big question is, how come that some are successful and some are not successful, like in Romania? So what makes the difference? And the difference, I think, is very, I mean, it's not rocket science, is that some people manage to get elected. So they have the people behind them, like Viktor Orban. I mean, there is a certain talent, actually, to have this traction with the population. And you have to admit it, he doesn't actually steal elections. And you have the other guys in Romania until last year, where they were hated by the population. They didn't manage to carry out elections. They lost elections. And it's very hard to fight Europe and fight NATO and put out propaganda if you don't have the people behind you. You know, it's very hard to find on both fronts, yeah, below and above you. And they lost. And I don't have a more scientific explanation than that. So it depends very much on their talent, on the imponderable things that makes politics what it is, right? So we have to see how they play their cards. I'm watching with very much concern what Vučić is doing in Serbia. Although Serbia is not a EU member country, is very important because Europe has invested a lot in Serbia, incidentally in the medical sector. They helped them reform in the last years, the medical sector. And you see all these games of Vučić and the prime minister now with Russia and China, so playing along with their propaganda basically for domestic political reasons. It's not that they love very much Kremlin or Beijing, I'm sure. It's their electoral strategy, it's their political strategy to rally the people with themes, with memes, and play with these things very skillfully in a way that some other people don't manage to do. Even if they try to implement the same agenda, they fail. I'm not sure how would Ruslan would judge the situation in Bulgaria, but I think this is an explanatory factor, and we can move to the east if you want, to Ukraine, to Moldova. I think the variable is the same. How credible leaders are with the public when they try to do something right, but also when they try to copy from the illiberal agenda as well.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, looking at the reactions all across Europe, not just Central and Eastern Europe, there was a, you know, it's of course it's domestic politics that matters most, but I think there has been some concern that the EU and NATO weren't quick to react, and of course NATO in this sense is not an organization that would immediately come to mind. But I think it's reassuring to know that in this time of uncertainty, there is an alliance that stands together and provides some baseline security to the citizens of the transatlantic union. But the EU, I think, has, you know, people have tried, and I think those that have tried, at least for now, have lost, to open the old wound of trying to do the blame game on Brussels. And I think this was clearly dispelled. You know, there was a blip of kind of PR campaign and storm coming from China and Russia, which have very deliberately used this, you know, in the case of Italy and in the case of also of the Western Balkans. But I think people are able to make their own decisions, and clearly, of course, they are very much supporting the lockdowns, because I saw there was a question also on this thing, but I don't think people everywhere are aware of the full extent of the measures. You know, people just agree with the lockdowns, agree with them staying physically distant. But at the same time, I don't think that this action was successful, and I think that the EU actually did prove that it has a role to play. And I think that people are looking up to the EU to actually mitigate some of the governance gaps or governance concerns that those countries might have. Of course, there is always the discussion about the legitimacy of institutions, but also the role of the European Parliament with its increase. For example, in the Western Balkans, with its very assertive reaction to let's start negotiations with North Macedonia and with Albania. With its assertive reaction, let's keep corridors, let's keep open borders as much as possible. Of course, we are not lunatics. We don't want to do both. Complete opening the borders just for the sake of having them open. Just so that somebody can say, this is the end of Schengen. Of course, it's not the end of Schengen, but at the same time, closing borders completely, just like some other countries did, is also not a solution.
Thank you, Ruslan. And we're coming to an end. Unfortunately, this has been a really interesting, good substance conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that were asked by our audience, but we promise to continue talking about these topics that we find crucial for the transatlantic alliance. Let's end on this note, and thank you, Ruslan, for raising it, that our system of alliances does matter, and it matters also directly for the citizen, not at just the grand political level or in terms of geopolitics. Thank you all for watching and for attending our event. It's been great talking to you.